Video games are an intoxicating concept that presents many highs and lows, with being able to invoke a sense of reaction or emotion toward the player. As with the multitude of popular genres within video games, these elements feel intensely real but don't present the same hold or nostalgia that is far more apparent and noticeable than within horror games. What began with early primitive pixelated horror game ideas and unusual soundtracks of the early to mid 80s, while hitting their peak during the evolution of 3D gaming during the mid 90s and early 2000s, the future looked promising. This was a time when horror games were all the rage, creating truly dark and terrifying experiences that impacted the player's mental state to a point that it would scare them to their core, keeping them awake at night and leaving them often too afraid to go back to play the game again. There was just something about the challenges of creating horror games with the limited technology and the ways in which these limitations actually added to the atmosphere an intense element of fear. It created an air of nostalgia and memories that very few gaming genres can replicate. And as technology advanced, graphics and visuals became more realistic, bringing about more intense elements of fear and terror that simply wasn't possible in previous gaming generations. But with the evolution of these elements came with it a massive change and shift in the focus of where horror games were heading. The inevitable focus would shift towards blending action with horror, which proved to be popular with Resident Evil 4 in 2005, and also during this time would see the rise of action games to become the main focus and selling point of video games during this generation. The Call of Duty franchise began to dominate the games industry, not only with its intense gameplay, but the story elements becoming more movie focused, while adding in multiplayer and co-op elements that proved to be very popular, as online gaming was rising in popularity, but was still in its infancy. Inevitably, many other popular gaming genres also began to follow the hype of these trends, as it was proven that action games were selling in higher numbers compared to any other game genre seen within the industry. So it was a simple case of adapting to the growing trend, or risk being left behind. This would also greatly affect the survival horror genre, which at that time began to suffer with the low volume of games being developed, and with the overall success seen with the release of Resident Evil 4 only solidified that shift in focus, resulting in almost every horror game being released over the next few years to have some elements of either co-op or multiplayer modes being added in, along with more fast-paced gameplay, which became a distant vision of game ideas seen in previous generations. This predominantly had become the new norm for video games during that time. The classic horror games of the past were all but forgotten. But over the last few years, there have been definite attempts to revitalise the survival horror genre with games like Amnesia, Outlast, and the iconic yet controversial PT demo on the PlayStation 4 from the creative mind of Hideo Kojima that would ask many questions while sparking much interest of a possible revival to return to the roots of survival horror. Many of these games would be responsible for the rise and success of many popular content creators, leading them to develop and create very lucrative businesses around their content ideas that would change their lives forever, while seeing a level of success never thought possible and yet unheard of at the time. But now, a new generation is rediscovering the terror of the past, as many new gamers and developers are starting to understand the potential of this forgotten genre. The rise of indie and low-poly horror games has helped to bring many new terrifying experiences and ideas to the forefront of gamers, leading larger companies to revisit these old concepts while realizing that the survival horror genre has even more potential than ever thought possible. Much of this success can be attributed to the upcoming success of popular content creators who would share their unique experiences of these games, opening up new potential audiences and fans interested in experiencing these games for themselves. AAA and indie game devs would begin to notice the rise in this craze, as the popularity of these online creators was contributing to the increasing sales of their titles. It was a wake-up call as they began to realise that there was still a lot of potential within the horror genre. And it wasn't just the nostalgia driving this resurgence. People were crying out for more experiences similar to that of classic games from previous generations. This would also prove to be the inspiration for many classic games to be revived through the use of remasters and re-releases on modern consoles, introducing a new generation to the terror of the past. Many of these games, such as Resident Evil, Resident Evil 0, which originally only would be accessible by owning either a Nintendo GameCube or Wii console, became accessible to a whole new audience of gamers through digital distribution on platforms such as PlayStation Network, Xbox Live and Steam that would sell in high numbers, with the Resident Evil remake becoming one of Capcom's best-selling games ever on digital platforms in recent years. This would spark the charge for demand as AAA devs now understood that the demand was real, which resulted in re-exploring the roots of survival horror gaming with the development and remasters of other important games in the genre, with remakes of both Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3, alongside of Resident Evil 4. Indie devs during this time would also be creating masterpieces of their own that would also build on the demand for new ways to scale players. Capcom would eventually create a new masterpiece in the genre, with Resident Evil 7 Biohazard in 2017, becoming one of the most intense and unnerving video games of all time, and is currently considered as the scariest game in the series to date, along with Resident Evil 8 Village, as it revisits its original intended gameplay roots of first-person horror, which was a concept originally intended for the first game in the series way back during the PlayStation and Sega Saturn days of the 32-bit console generation, but at the time wasn't deemed possible because of the level of ideas becoming unachievable due to the hardware limitations of the time. But as with modern technology advancing all of the time, it is becoming much easier for game devs to mimic various elements from older classic games of previous generations, utilising various graphic and visual styles, while modernising and simplifying the gameplay and control styles to allow for easier pick up and play features that simply were not possible with development materials and hardware of previous generations. An example of this would be now having the ability to play classic video games on modern consoles or computers through the use of emulation, while updating the control systems for many classic games to now work with the use of analog or smoother controls, while still giving players the ability or the option to play with the original control styles, providing access to many classic games to new and older audiences that either want to experience or revisit these classic games for themselves. And with the opportunities to play and buy games from online platforms with Steam, itch.io, goodoldgames.com, the PlayStation Network, among many others, it allows players to get access to many of these older, modern and indie or even prototype style games with relative ease, for a price or even for free. So now is the perfect time to experience many of these unique horror games for yourself. And now with the rise of online gaming and streaming platforms, players are able to share their experiences with a global audience. The fear is no longer confined to the home or arcade. It's now accessible to anyone with an internet connection. As the resurgence of classic horror continues to grow, it's important to acknowledge the games that have paved the way for this new wave of fear. From the earlier survival horror games like Resident Evil and Dino Crisis, Overblood and Silent Hill, to more recent titles like Outlast and Amnesia, these games have left a lasting impact on the genre. These games pushed the boundaries of what was possible in the genre, and their influence can still be seen in games today. The resurgence of classic horror is not just about rediscovering the past, it's about understanding the impact that these games had on the genre and how they continue to shape the future of horror. And it isn't just about the games themselves, it's about the experience they provide overall. These classic horror games were designed to be played in a way to create tension and fear, either with friends or on your own, while the fear would be amplified by the shared experience. And when we think about the fear, that isn't the only addicting element, as it's about the thrill more than anything else. These classic horror games, with their limited technology and simple gameplay, offer a level of challenge that can't be found in today's more modern, advanced titles, as they require a unique level of skill, strategy and nerves of steel to survive and endure. The resurgence of classic horror is not just a nostalgia trip, it's a celebration of the fear, the thrill and the shared experience that these games provide. The feeling horror games present to you is beyond anything that can be seen or witnessed in any other genre within video games. Many developers are taking inspiration from the simplicity and minimalism of classic horror games, using them to create new, immersive horror experiences that focus on atmosphere and psychological elements that can create a level of tension and uncertainty which only heightens the level of fear. Others are using the advancements in technology to create more realistic and immersive worlds, where the fear is not just in the game, but in the player's mind. These psychological elements witnessed in games like Silent Hill have given birth to and provided a new template to develop experiences that dive into the mind of the player to present an aura or feeling that they simply cannot get anywhere else, which adds to the addictive nature and qualities of these games, because we as people are curious about what we don't know, and these gaming experiences allow us to dive into the unknown. The resurgence of classic horror is also not just about looking back, it's about looking forward. It's about taking the best of the past and using it to shape the future of horror games, and isn't just limited to the gaming community. It's also inspiring a new wave of horror media across different platforms. From movies, TV shows and books to comics and graphic novels, the influence of classic horror games can now be seen everywhere. And this new wave of horror media is not just for hardcore fans, it's for everyone. It's about bringing the fear to a wider audience and introducing new people to the world of classic horror. The resurgence of classic horror is not just a trend, it has now become a cultural phenomenon. It's about celebrating the fear and the thrill of the past, while looking forward to the events of the future. The past may be gone, but the terror lives on, as the classic horror revival is well and truly upon us. But this is just the beginning of a new era of fear, and with it provides the celebration and the thrill that these games have provided and continue to provide. But what about the future of horror games? How will the resurgence of classic horror influence the development of these type of games in the years to come? To dive more into these elements, you will need to check out this next video, which demonstrates the dominance of horror games over the generations and the modern era.